Yes, go.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. I recognize a lot of you as regular attendees of our Saturday afternoon talks. We have a very special and unusual, I would say, woman to speak to us today. She sort of dropped out of the skies for us. We had another talk lined up, but he crapped out to go to a conference up in Massachusetts. I wasn't going to let him off the hook, but the other people on the program committee let him off, but he'll be here in October. Anyway, our speaker today is safe to say, lifelong enthusiast of Edgar Allan Poe, at least for all of her adult life. And she is executive director of the Edgar Allan Poe House in Baltimore. But she also has she's the director of the International Edgar Allan Poe Festival and Awards, featuring the Saturday Visitor, spelled E-R on the end. There must be some significance to that, but I'll let you explain it. Sure. A new honor recognizing outstanding creative works adapting or inspired by the life and writing of Edgar Allan Poe. She had a double major at University of California, Berkeley, in English, literature, and rhetoric. I didn't know they still taught rhetoric, but I'm glad to hear that they do. And she has a Master's of Fine Arts in Professional Writing from the Savannah College of Art and Design. She also has an avocation involving graphic novels and graphic comics. So really interesting person. And she's going to tell us about Edgar Allan Poe and his family, his predecessors, and how they made it possible for Poe to live the literary life he did. And maybe she'll tell us something about the circumstances of his death. If you don't know about it, you should read about it. It's the biggest mystery he ever left us. To read about it is to start reading an Edgar Allan Poe mystery, but this one has no resolution. So here's Enrica Jang.
Hi, everybody. I am super nervous pulling up to see so many folks here today, but I always try to remember, anytime I get sort of excited about this, they're coming to see me talk. They're here to see Poe. This is the power of Poe, and he's dead. I'm here.
I showed up to see you.
It's Edgar Allan Poe, the power of Poe. I am here today, though, to talk about important members of Edgar Allan Poe's family. Long before there ever was an Edgar Allan Poe, Poe's grandparents noted in the city for their contribution to the Revolutionary War, as well as the War of 1812. And their service very much made his career possible. And I'll kind of draw these lines for everybody. So it's the reason for the talk today. It is a great pleasure to be a historian at Poe House, share with people Poe's history, but when you get to start to share with things that they may not realize. And as we approach the 250th birthday of the United States, it's really a lot of fun to share this Revolutionary War connection. And then next year is the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's return visit to the United States. This is going to be a several state campaign. Baltimore figures very prominently in that tour. Just a huge celebration next year. Follow the Frenchmen. So we'll be talking a little bit about that significance today too. So that's the purpose of our talk. So thank you guys for being here. And here lies a noble heart. We'll talk about the Poes of Baltimore. Now to share with you, I am the director of the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum. Poe Baltimore is the nonprofit organization created to fund, maintain, and interpret the Edgar Allan Poe House. This is the only surviving home in the city of Baltimore where Poe and his family know to have lived. A very tiny house museum on the west side of Baltimore. Tiny but mighty. Baltimore really loves Poe. We have the body, he is buried in Baltimore, but people come from all over the world to Poe House to learn about Edgar Allan Poe, probably one of the most famous writers in the world, and so we're very, very fortunate to welcome so many people. We keep Poe's chamber door open to visitors, and the second part of our mission is to celebrate Edgar Allan Poe's legacy, both here in Baltimore and beyond. really drawing a direct line from Edgar Allan Poe to the present day. We do that with citywide programming. We are the home of the International Edgar Allan Poe Festival and Awards, celebrating our 6th year for the festival this year, and the Saturday Visitor Awards that you mentioned, and I'll talk about that at the end of the chat today. But Poe Baltimore, a nonprofit, we do hope will come out. Brief plug for Poe House on the next slide. We are open to visitors every Thursday through Sunday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. This is the first year, actually, we're also open on Wednesdays during our busy season. So this summer we're opening up on Wednesdays. But we are open on a reservation-only basis. People come to Baltimore kind of expecting the House of Usher, and instead they find a very tiny, humble 600 square foot house, very precious historic site. So we've got to make a reservation to come and visit, but highly worth it, we promise. 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. and you can find more on our website. Now the agenda today, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the man who needs no introduction and talk to you a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe, but then we will talk about the Poes of Baltimore. I also have a short video to share starring J. Scott Watkins, Baltimore native, an actor and living history performer who teamed up with this last year for the Virginia Poe Bicentennial. It's the 200th birthday of Edgar Allan Poe's child, bride, and daughter of Baltimore. And so we'll be talking about the Poe family in that video. And then I will explain the War of 1812 connection when a 71-year-old Edgar Allan Poe's grandfather, David Poe Sr., volunteers to fight for Baltimore in the War of 1812. And that historical significance, just this, again, that through line from history, drawing a direct line from Poe to the present day, and how this has shaped our lives in ways that you may not have thought about. So we'll begin. So again, he needs no introduction. Edgar Allan Poe, one of the most famous writers in the world, known for these Gothic works. The Raven, Telltale Heart, my favorite, Cask of Amontillado, followed the House of Usher. The Raven, of course, arguably his most famous poem, makes him popularly famous even in his lifetime. It captures the imagination of the nation. It's a Gothic romantic poem that travels around the world, makes Poe internationally famous. He is also the father of the detective story. It's not that there was no such thing as a mystery before Edgar Allan Poe, but Poe is the first writer in English literature to create a character at the heart of a story whose job it is to solve a mystery by step-by-step deductive reasoning called ratiocination in his stories. So that character at the heart of the story who's solving this mystery for you. Poe creates this template, and even the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, where was the detective story before Poe breathed the breath of life into it? So when you consider any mystery novel you have ever read, any police procedural you've ever seen on television, even animation like Scooby-Doo, we have a direct line from Poe to our present day, and he continues to shape popular culture to this day. Now, when we talk about the Poe family today, we're talking about a military history in the Poe family. Edgar Allan Poe himself does have a very brief military history, and if anybody in the audience has a Netflix, might have seen The Pale Blue Eye. If you have an opportunity to read that book by Louis Bayard, highly recommend it. It is one of my favorite books on this planet. It made me ugly cry when I read this book. So highly recommend the book. The movie is absolutely fantastic. You see Christian Bale and Harry Melling in the story here. Poe was in fact a cadet at West Point. But give you a brief overview. During Poe's life, again, very brief military career. Initially, Poe is raised by a foster family in Richmond, Virginia, and initially sent to the University of Virginia for his formal education. Ends up having to withdraw from school in a very short time for gambling debts and for debt. If you go to the University of Virginia, it's the university started by Thomas Jefferson. Poe attended it. As a matter of fact, the second year the university even existed. This is the year that Jefferson passed away. He did have to withdraw. When you go there, they're very proud of the fact that He's their most famous dropout. You see that on a t-shirt. You can visit a room dedicated to Poe. You push the button, his voice rains down on you, and you can look into this room where Poe, his dorm room, preserved there. But he has to withdraw from school for lack of money, runs home to Richmond, and unfortunately, the creditors follow, try to hit his foster father out for some of these debts. It's a terrible fight. Some of us parents sent us to school with plenty of money, might sort of feel a little bit of this pinch for poor Edgar, but they have a terrible fight. Poe sets out on the road, determined to make it on his own, defy his foster father's disappointment, and kind of make it on his own. He ends up traveling to Boston, where he managed to self-publish a little bit of poetry, a book called Tamerlane. But making your living as a poet then, just as now, pretty tough to do. And so when he can't support himself, he changes his name and he enlists in the army. And eventually is stationed at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. Now, while he's in the military, he actually achieves, he actually seems to do pretty well, whether it's the structure, whether his superior officers are just impressed with him. He rises through the ranks very quickly. In just 2 years, achieves Sergeant Major in artillery. And so his superior officers clearly realize there's something special about this young man going by the name of Edgar Carey, and they think there might be a future for him. So the story comes out, what has happened to him, his aborted education at UVA, this terrible fight with his foster father, John Allan, and his superior officers suggest that Edgar Allan Poe might have a career giving orders instead of taking them. He could potentially attend West Point, become an officer, finish his education, and this could be his future. And because he's doing so well, this is something that a young Edgar Allan Poe decides, all right, I'm going to try to do this. So he writes to his foster father after a silence of about 2 years, says, I'm in the army now, get me out of here. Because at that time, you could pay someone to take your place in the enlisted ranks, and that would free him up to go to West Point. Initially, John Allan refuses. He remembers this terrible fight. You're in the army, make a man out of you, just stay where you are. But then his wife passes away, and this is Edgar's foster mother. And the two men reconcile very briefly in their shared grief for her, and John Allan relents, helps Poe buy out his enlistment, and Poe comes back to Baltimore to wait to get into West Point. He's going to get in, but there's a waiting list. And there's a very famous story of Poe walking from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. To see the Secretary of War, and that's where he's told that he'll get in, but there's a waiting list. So he comes back to Baltimore, and he's waiting a year. In the meantime, Edgar Allan Poe is out of the army, enjoying life, kind of getting into a little bit of trouble with his brother and his cousins here in the city. In the meantime, his foster father marries again, is having children with his new wife, so that by the time Poe makes it to West Point, he is a cadet, he doesn't really want to be there anymore. He realizes that it's a very austere lifestyle. The academy is brand new at this time too. Life as a cadet, to this day, pretty tough. And Poe decides he just doesn't want to be there anymore. So he gets himself kicked out. He stops going to class. He stops going to chapel, which is not something you do at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And he is court-martialed for dereliction of duty and sent out. And that is the end of his relationship with John Allan, his foster father. He finds refuge with his blood relatives in Baltimore, and this is when he embarks on building a new career in writing. So this is Edgar Allan Poe's military career, and a little bit sad how it ended, but all's well that ends well. Not for Poe, but for us, because he eventually launches a professional writing career, which is why we're all here and interested at all. Makes him so famous. But this is Poe's military history. What we are talking about today, though, going a little bit further back, 2 steps back. Poe's parents are traveling actors. Edgar Allan Poe's parents are traveling actors. Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins, David Poe Jr., David Poe and Elizabeth Cairns Poe, Edgar Allan Poe's grandparents. And as I said in my introduction, long before there ever was an Edgar Allan Poe, David Poe Sr. and his wife Elizabeth Cairns Poe were noted for their service in the Revolution. You can see too that very much defenders of liberty and very much for the American cause. They've named their children John Hancock Poe, George Washington Poe. So you see this devotion even in the family here. But this is a look at the family tree. We'll go back to this in a little while, but I have a video to show you kind of talking about who these folks are. But we'll go next up here. So we're talking about David Poe Sr. This is an Irish family, born in County Cavan, Ireland. 1742, he immigrates here with his father. Primary business as a maker of spinning wheels and clock reels in Baltimore. And though he achieves the rank of major, eventually he's known affectionately as the General. Now there are, again, no images of David Poe Sr., but this is a marker at his grave in Baltimore, Maryland, at Westminster Hall and Burying Ground at the corner of Fayette and Green Street. And you can visit David Poe Sr. Now I'm sure his ghost kind of keeps watching people walk straight past him, straight to his grandson's grave, but this is a marker honoring the man. We'll also be talking about Elizabeth. I have an image here. This is kind of fun. We don't have an image from David Poe Sr., but we do actually have a signature from David Poe Sr. And you see a lot of, because he was a quartermaster, Assistant Deputy Quartermaster General in the city of Baltimore, we do have a lot of his letters to the governor and this kind of thing in the 76 papers. So this is just a picture of his signature here. The next slide, we'll talk about Elizabeth Cairns Poe. Again, no images of her. Born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I said that right, Lancaster. I get corrected by that from those folks from PA. Also of Irish descent, but she does share her husband's energy and patriotism. And one of the things that I do always want to emphasize is, as we're talking about the Poe family, we're talking about the both of them. David Poe Sr.'s contribution is quite extraordinary, and we're going to learn about that. But Elizabeth Cairns Poe was at his side. There's a coin going around the room now. A coin minted in 1974 by Daughters of the American Revolution, honoring great women of the Revolution. This is the front and the back side of those coins. Working under her supervision, the women and girls of Baltimore made uniforms for the Marquis de Lafayette's troops, and their efforts supported his campaign in the South. So we're going to get into that detail in just a bit. But if you have an opportunity, I need that coin back. Nobody take that with you. But you can see that, and it's being passed around the room. So the next video, again, last year was the Virginia Poe bicentennial, and we created this video in celebration of the Poe family. But here is J. Scott Watkins, native of Baltimore, as David Poe Sr.
Hello, I'm David Poe Sr. I was born in Cavan, Ireland, and my parents came into Baltimore in the 1750s, where eventually I became a wheelwright and began making spinning wheels and all sorts of carriage wheels, and also opening up a dry goods merchant service.
I was born in Dreamtownland, Kildallan Parish, County Cavan, Ireland, in 1742. My father, John Poe, and my mother, Jane McBride, moved to Baltimore in the 1750s. I am a Presbyterian of Scots-Irish background. I married Elizabeth Cairns in 1775. Our children were John Hancock Poe, William Adam Poe, George Washington Poe, David Poe Jr., Samuel Poe, and Maria Poe. We lived on Market Street, where I practiced my trade as a wheelwright and ran a dry goods store. When the War for Independence began, my brothers George, John, and I enlisted in the militia.
They made me Deputy Quartermaster General. They used to call me affectionately the General, but it's actually only a Major.
The duties of a quartermaster are many and very demanding. We are responsible for everything, including clothing, food, camp supplies, weapons, ammunition, dealing with civilian merchants, transport, and even selecting battlegrounds and drawing up orders of battle. As well, we also take the right position on the field of battle. I was a compatriot to Gilbert de Motier, also known as the Marquis de Lafayette. When the French army encamped in Baltimore on their way to Yorktown, they needed 500 bearers of pantaloons. My wife Elizabeth Cairns enlisted many ladies with the talents of a seamstress to meet the demand. The ladies met in the assembly rooms and completed the order. The women during the Revolution were vital in securing our victory, from nursing to fighting to maintaining farms and other food supplies. The War of Independence would not have been won without our women.
My brothers George and John Poe also fought in the American Revolution. They were in McClellan's company and were at the Battle of Germantown, just outside of Philadelphia.
Our devotion to liberty cost us much. John was captured and died on the prison ship Jersey.
When the Continental Army needed money for supplies and they didn't have it, I gave $40,000 of my own money to fund whatever they needed. I never got repaid for it, but in my heart I did believe in liberty. I did believe in the United States.
Together with my wife Elizabeth, we gave much to build this city, this state, and this nation, but I died nearly penniless in 1816. When years later the Marquis de Lafayette returned to Baltimore, he asked for me, his friend David Poe. When he learned of my death, he asked for my widow and visited my grave. When he saw my poor Elizabeth bedridden and destitute in the care of our daughter Maria, he shamed the city fathers into giving her a pension. My daughter Maria, a widow herself and caring for 2 small children of her own, moved the family to Amity Street at the edge of the city to escape a cholera epidemic in 1832. If it wasn't for the pension our family finally received for our service in the American Revolution, there would have been no rent money to pay for the house on 3 Amity Street. My grandson Edgar would find a home with them there. This home would provide him refuge and freedom to pen his early works.
Scott Watkins is a member of the Sons of the Revolution State of Maryland, and a wonderful contributor. And his participation in the program last year, he found his own family connection to the project. He is a descendant of the Sextons from Westminster Hall, who were present at all of the burials of Edgar Allan Poe. He was buried 3 times. There was only one Poe, but he was buried 3 times, and George Spence was the sexton and so it was a lot of fun when you find these connections to your own life. That's when history really does come alive, and so that's been a lot of fun. So there's a lot of information in that video, but just give you a sense of the depth of service from David Poe Sr., again Edgar Allan Poe's grandfather. Family settles in Baltimore, and very quickly David Poe Sr. establishes his business, establishes himself as part of the city, and he's a member of the Whig Club. Eventually, as the revolution's heating up, and a lot of unrest in the city, he is one of the Sons of Liberty jumping in to expelling Robert Christie, the Royal Sheriff of Baltimore, later one of a mob that threatens to tar and feather William Goddard, who is a loyalist publisher who is critical of George Washington. So we right away see a man of passion getting involved, and he's clearly picked a side. This is a man who a great devotion to liberty. He becomes a sergeant in the company of Captain James Cox after whose death at Germantown 1777. He's under Captain McClellan, and he gets his commission in 1778. 17th of September 1779, he's appointed Assistant Deputy Quartermaster for Baltimore with the rank of Major. It is a lot of fun for the folks in this group who might want to go through the archives. You will see several of his letters going back and forth to Governor Lee, General Smallwood, talking about the money that needs to get sent in to pay for supplies, drayage, this kind of thing. And many times, there are many instances of David Poe Sr. fronting the money that he is being told is going to pay back to him. It's like, I didn't get the thing that you said was going to get me this money, so I'm working on my credit to make sure that we have this, and even a tone of despair when he does have to give up some of the horses that they cannot find drayage for. So this is a man seriously involved, very devoted, and noted for this. Now, where things get really fun, tied in with Marquis de Lafayette's history. In 1780, Marquis de Lafayette is passing through Baltimore with some ragged colonial troops who are in great need. And even though he as an officer is invited to a ball in the city, he is asked how he finds everything. The Marquis expresses a little bit of upset that he sees this beautiful party in front of him, but he can't feel good about it because his soldiers need uniforms. And when the Poes hear that there is a need, immediately David Poe Sr. Offers $500 to the Marquis to help with materials, and that night the assembly room in Baltimore is turned into seamstress factory where Elizabeth Cairns Poe is, with her own hands, cutting 500 pairs of pants for the Marquis de Lafayette soldiers and superintending several women in the city to get that order done so that the soldiers will have. So 500 pairs of pants for the Marquis de Lafayette soldiers. Take that, that's yours. That's a big deal, right? So, but this is something that the Marquis de Lafayette remembers, and just one of the services that David Poe Sr. does provide for Cause of Liberty in Baltimore. There is an unpublished letter that is mentioned in Mary Phillips' biography that is, I am reading here, is at Harvard. I couldn't find an image of it on the paper, but it looks like David Poe was entrusted with transporting some troops as well in 1782. So quite a bit of service here to be really, really proud of and see. As we go further on, looking at post-revolution, after the war, he's kind of settling into peacetime for a very, very brief time, engaging in dry goods business in Baltimore and a member of the First Branch City Council. He's a founding member of the First Presbyterian Church in Baltimore City. So we see Poe, the Poe family, with great standing in Baltimore. Now here's where it gets kind of interesting, because according to several of Poe's biography, of course this interest is in Edgar Allan Poe. We're interested in the Poe family because of their very famous grandson, but when you start to pull this thread and kind of see this connection and what is there and what is in the history, we see a remarkable American family, an incredible American story. And by accounts, General Poe, when the war is breaking out, 1812, and Baltimore, Chesapeake is getting threatened. We've got the regular soldiers fighting in Canada, and it's up to the Chesapeake to defend themselves. We have stories of a 71-year-old David Poe Sr. signing up, volunteering with the militia to fight Battle of Baltimore, Battle of North Point. He is listed as private in Captain Robert Lawson's Baltimore Patriots, 5th Regiment. Now we'll talk a little bit about trying to find some of this history. This is an oft-told story, but we're looking for the clues. Poe created the detective story, so we can be detectives and start to look for this history. But he does die at the age of 74 in 1816. And this obituary is really quite lovely. Died on Thursday afternoon in the 74th year of his age, Mr. David Poe, a native of Ireland and for the last 40 years a resident of Baltimore. Mr. Poe was an early and decided friend of American liberty and was actively engaged in promoting that cause during the Revolutionary War. He died as he lived, a zealous Republican, regretted by an extensive circle of relatives and friends. Now, David Poe's wife survives him. And as you heard in the video, the family is not repaid for their service. It's a lot of bureaucracy, we've got some letters signed by some folks. This isn't really a debt that the government has to pay. And the family falls into poverty. And Elizabeth Cairns Poe comes to live with her own widowed daughter and is bedridden. Years later, 1824, 200 years ago, because we're celebrating this anniversary next year, it's the 200th anniversary next year, when General Lafayette returns to the United States to tour the country he had helped fight for. He is feted by, this is a several state tour, it's supposed to last about like 4 or 5 months, it goes on for 13 months. Everywhere he goes, you have people welcoming General Lafayette, celebrating the fighting Frenchmen who came to help and tour this country that he helped fight for. When the Marquis de Lafayette returns to Baltimore, he meets with several of the veterans of the Revolutionary War. And when he finds that one of them is missing, he asks for the Poes by name. And he learns of David Poe's death. When he learns that his widow is living in penury, he shames the government. He shames the state government into honoring their service. He tells the story of the 500 pairs of pants, and there's we have one story, it's a very French story, it's very, very romantic, and I absolutely love it. We don't have proof that this happened, but there is an account that before he left the city, the Marquis goes to David Poe's grave, falls to his knees, and he kisses the ground, and he says, "Ici repose un noble." Here lies a noble heart. So this beautiful, I want to believe it's true. I think it's true, but it's such a lovely notion. The next slide is that quote. Again, everybody is celebrating Lafayette, and Lafayette turns to them and says, "Where's David Poe?" And when he learns of the family, he does this great service for them. Now, it's important to note that because the family receives this pension, Elizabeth Cairns Poe does receive $240. So this is something that the family needs quite desperately, and it makes it possible for them to move to 203 North Amity Street, which is today the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum. So you can see why we have a great interest in this story, because it wouldn't have been possible, the family wouldn't have been able to live here. Now, I mentioned that Edgar Allan Poe was raised by a foster family in Richmond, Virginia, and eventually becomes estranged from them. Well, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit. Can you skip to, and maybe we'll go, actually I'll tell you what, we're going to step back just a moment because we want to talk about the 1814 connection here. So yeah, go to the next slide, please. So here's the account from 3 Poe biographers as early as 1877, 1926, and 1941, where it is mentioned that when Battle of Baltimore, everybody's gearing up and the militia are signing up, David Poe does sign up under Captain Lawson's group. These are the quotes that we pull from their biography, and you can see that they're kind of, especially the English teacher in the room that we have, you can see that it's sort of like a rephrasing of this original phrase here. When Baltimore was threatened by the British, September 1814, General Poe volunteered in defense of the city, and although then 71 years old, he takes part in an active part in the Battle of North Point, where the enemy were ignominiously defeated by the brave militia of Maryland. So we have this connection, and then we have this rephrasing here in 1926, and then we have a shorter phrasing here in 1941. So this is a story that Poe biographers do accept, but we are kind of pulling at the threads of this mystery to try to find, we have quite a bit of documentation of David Poe Sr.'s service in the Revolution, and in this story that is often repeated about him. And so we're going to look at the clues that indicate that this is in fact the David Poe Sr. who does this. Going to the next slide here. David Poe is listed as a private under Robert Lawson, Captain Robert Lawson of the Baltimore Patriots, the militia that goes up. And it was pointed out in our group here that these are likely Irish, sort of an Irish community militia signing up together. He is listed in the 1889 reprint of the Citizen Soldiers at North Point and Fort McHenry, which is a list of the muster of the rolls. And we see him, this is pretty consistently a name. Now, there are a lot of Poes, it's an Irish family, and so how do we know that this is the David Poe that did this? We do have some compelling evidence to show that this is in fact the David Poe, because it's kind of amazing. 71, back then, what's this 71-year-old man doing jumping in, and what's he doing as a private? So we got a little bit of a mystery here. And we go to the next slide and we see the Baltimore Directory, Fry's Baltimore Directory in 1810. There is only one David Poe listed in the city of Baltimore. That we see George Poe, his brother, and we see a Thomas Poe, who does not appear to be one of the Poe family that we are talking about today. So we have 3 households by the name of Poe in the directory here, and David is the only one. And we do know in the David Poe, the Edgar Allan Poe line family that we're talking about, there are no other David Poes. Edgar Allan Poe's father is dead by this time. And so there are no other Davids in the family. Skip ahead to 1812, and once again we see only, where are they? David Poe, Gentleman Park Lane, a different address, only Poe here, and the only David Poe listed in the city. So this is a little bit of compelling evidence as we go forward. Now if we skip ahead to 1814, we see David Poe disappear here, and only Thomas is listed. It's possible that there may have been a David Poe in the household of a Thomas Poe, but we don't have a record of him. So until we find that guy, David Poe seems to be the guy that signs up in the Baltimore militia, and that's pretty compelling. So thinking about the story, thinking about the significance, the family is living destitute, and in 1824, it's Lafayette who shames them into giving Elizabeth Cairns Poe this pension. She gets a $240 a year pension that goes to this family very much in need. When Poe is estranged from his foster family, we told you about that story with West Point, that's kind of the end of his relationship with the Allans, he does find refuge with his blood relatives here in Baltimore. And the family, because they're receiving this pension, they can move to Amity Street, which is kind of not quite countryside, but it's the edge of town. The city of Baltimore, not pushed as far west at this time. They're moving away from a cholera epidemic in the center of the city. And so this is a significant move for them. And they become quite close. So close, in fact, that eventually Edgar Allan Poe will marry his first cousin Virginia, and his aunt becomes his mother-in-law. But this is a significant part of his biography that happens at Amity Street, and that's made possible for this pension. Elizabeth Cairns Poe dies in 1835, which unfortunately pulls the family even closer because of the financial straits that they find themselves in once that pension is gone, when it dies with her. So this becomes a very important part of Edgar Allan Poe's biography, and a significant part of why Edgar Allan Poe House in Baltimore is famous. It's famous because he lived there. It's famous because he makes his chosen family there, finds refuge with his blood relatives, all made possible because of the service of his grandparents, and famous because Poe begins his professional writing career in Baltimore. So pretty significant and important for us, an important part of our story. Later, Edgar Allan Poe, having married his first cousin Virginia, she falls desperately ill, lingers over a long period of time. She dies just 10 years after their marriage, a very young woman. But it's a very painful illness. She's dying of tuberculosis, lingering disease. She lingers over a period of 5 years. And at this time, Edgar Allan Poe writes that the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical subject in the world. And we see that, of course, in the poem, The Raven. And when he writes this, he has a beautiful dying wife at home. So we see this history, kind of step by step, how it all comes together, and how it shapes the life of Edgar Allan Poe, and then how it shapes all of our lives today. So this is a picture of Edgar and Virginia. So as if anybody is interested in learning more, as you mentioned, a little bit more about Edgar Allan Poe's death, I'm happy to answer any of those questions as well. But his death is still a mystery, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But if you're interested just in more information about Poe's life, just in general, I've got some suggested reading on the next slide. Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore, we noted the names that I have and a lot of the references I have here. eapo.org is probably the definitive. It's a wonderful, wonderful source of information about Edgar Allan Poe. Lots of links to that primary material, research material. So highly recommend anybody who's interested, or if you're doing a report, you need to get some information that's true. Don't listen to that podcast. Find it at eapoe.org. Plus, Poe people love to fight about Poe. Nothing goes on that website that hasn't been argued within an inch of its life and documented. So that's a great place to go to know that you found the truth. Edgar Allan Poe, A Mournful Never-Ending Remembrance, a biography by Kenneth Silverman. If you're interested, I've got a copy of the book here. You can see it. Take a picture of the ISBN number if you'd like. And then Edgar Allan Poe's Baltimore by David Galen is a wonderful book about what the city was like in Edgar Allan Poe's day, a little bit after David Poe Sr.'s day. But we see a little bit of that history if you're interested in more of that. Or you can just come to Poe House. You can do that too. Speaking of, if you are interested in the death of Edgar Allan Poe, there's some stuff I can share with you, but we do offer a bus tour every first Saturday of the month through September, or through October, I should say. Those tickets you can find on sale now at poebaltimore.org. This October, we're also really pleased. Next slide. Really pleased. This is the 6th year of the International Edgar Allan Poe Festival. I want to stress, this is a free 2-day event held in the shadow of Poe House. We have vendors, stage, food, performances. You can hang out with a bunch of your fellow Poe fans, which I hope, you're probably Poe fans if you came to this talk in the first place, but I hope you're Poe fans now and want to learn more. So please come on out, especially in October. And of course, please support Poe Baltimore in our effort to keep Poe's chamber door open to visitors. So I'm here for any questions if anybody has them. Yes, sir.
I have two.
Yes, sir.
First off, because I'm not quite clear, how did he become a foster the people in Virginia? How did he end up going there?
Because Poe's parents are traveling actors.
Okay.
This is, when we're talking about Poe's family, every family's got their kind of like their struggles and their, unfortunately, David Poe Sr., noted in his city, wants his son to be something kind of, serious and boring, like a lawyer.
Right.
And instead, his son, David Poe Jr., falls in love with the theater, falls in love with a beautiful British actress named Eliza Poe, and essentially runs away with the circus. And they go off, and they're traveling actors. Poe happens to be born in Boston, and that only happens. There's no family connection to Boston. His parents are performing there, living there for a brief time, and so that's how Poe came to be born in Boston. But they're traveling. Now, despite his aspirations, David Poe Jr. was not that good. The reviews that survive of his performances are pretty dismal, and it's sad. But Poe's mother, on the other hand, is a noted actress. Fame does not equal fortune for any member of the Poe family, but she's very well known. Now, one of the first mysteries of Poe's life is what happens to David Poe Jr., his father. He disappears. The presumption is that maybe the struggle, because he's not doing very well, maybe potentially struggle with alcoholism, he might have abandoned the family, and that is said often. But there's no record of a resting place, final cause of death. There's no history of where he died. And so the very first mystery of Poe's life, what happens to his dad? I believe that if he had abandoned his family, unfortunately, his parents never hear from him again. And even a man who might have left his kids, his family might have heard something. So we don't know what happened to David Poe Jr. Poe's mother, on the other hand, because she is noted, unfortunately falls very, very ill at a very young age. Again, tuberculosis. And when she's in Richmond, Virginia, the theater appeals to the public on her behalf. This beautiful light of the stage, has 3 children in terrible shape, and this may be the last time anybody can help her. And so the society ladies rally around Eliza Poe's deathbed. And Frances Allan is married to John Allan, who is a Scottish immigrant and merchant in the city. They have no children, but they're patrons of the theater. And when Eliza Poe dies, they're very keen to take in Edgar. And there's a daughter, Rosalie, Poe's younger sister, Rosalie, taken in by another family in Richmond, Virginia. Now, Henry Leonard Poe, Poe's older brother, is already staying with his grandparents in Baltimore, and that's how he comes to be raised by the family here. So it's pretty catastrophic, really, part of Poe's life. The children are separated, raised in different families. But Leonard is old enough to kind of understand what's happened to his family and know his mother has died and to ask to his little brother. Edgar is only 2.5, about 2 years old at this time. But the families do keep in loose contact with one another. Now it's important to note, Poe is fostered, never formally adopted. And that's another kind of that's another strain in the family, another reason he becomes estranged from the Allan family. He's raised by them, never allowed to forget that he's a foster son. He's never formally adopted. And when John Allan dies, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, he leaves Edgar nothing. Leaves him nothing. So.
But quick second question, because you're so enthused about this. Are you Native American that you like Poe that much, or?
I just love Poe. So, again, that power of Poe was just kind of like this magnet. And I followed a boy here, so he's here today. But what I find is that my background is literature, and I love Poe, just reading Poe, and I wrote comics inspired by Poe, and so this was an interest. But, and it's a bit of a sin for a historian to get too deeply involved in the story. So to appreciate the literature, you don't necessarily have to know a lot about Poe's biography, and some people might argue you shouldn't. It's the literature that should speak for itself. What I find, though, is that it is very human, Poe's story. Everybody might have different notions about Poe, or what you might, like impressions that you have about Poe, and again, being at Poe House, sharing with people that sometimes the truth is just as strange as fiction. Not all the things that people believe, the conspiracy theories people believe about Poe, are true. He was not kind of a passive victim of his talent. This stuff wasn't pouring out of him. Poe was very intentional. He's a master. He's asked point blank, why do you write about gothic things? Why are you writing about this scary stuff? And his very flippant answer is, it's going to sell. It's going to sell you magazines. And he's doing this on purpose, and he believes that literature you should feel something very strong when you read it, and there's nothing stronger than those primal emotions of love and fear and death. And so this is a man who is doing this on purpose, and there's a lot of intention. The persona of Poe's writing often gets confused with the man himself. But I do find his story is compelling, and I really like this idea of the family service being the thing that makes his career possible. He makes his chosen family, he finds refuge with his blood relatives, but they stay a family for the rest of their lives. And all of that's made possible because of this devotion to liberty. And that's just this wonderful thing that you can feel. And imagine this 71-year-old man who, all that fire and he's, tarring and feathering, and he's one of these guys who's really passionate and certainly, again, this is a man who's picked a side, fighting in the revolution. 71, they're coming back, we're just going to beat him again. And you can just picture the fire in this man who, I'm going back, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to do it again. I love that.
That part was really interesting. I'm also a big Poe fan too. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm also a big Poe fan too. Maybe it's because, like I said, I was a moody teenager, but gosh, I just loved him, and I love the horror and stuff. But the funny thing is that he really is somebody that, I mean, everyone just goes by like what they know, like the cult classic of Poe, like the horror, the fact that he's so like depressed and the alcoholism, but that was also something that was like brought on by, I guess you could call them his haters. Like, I think there was one guy specifically, I can't remember his name, maybe if you know with a W, but he specifically would always trash him, like all the time. And weird thing about Poe is that he did go through like large stints of like not touching alcohol at all, like at all. And the other odd thing about Poe is that no one really like sees like his detective stories or anything like that, but he also has a lot of really great like poems and stories about like kind of like romance and like this. Yes, there is death like kind of coinciding with it, but it's a part of his life. Like, he had a lot of death in the beginning. Like, I know he was like, his first love, not just Virginia, was this one woman, I think her name was Jane Seymour,
Standard.
That's who it was. I don't know why I always say Stan, but I thought that was very interesting. Like he would take, like he would have like a lot of like romantic, like weirdly like romantic, like I guess like adventures really with like all these different types of women, but never cheated on anyone as it seemed. Like he was devoted, but they would go on like romantic walks through like the cemetery and stuff, and I remember feeling so like surprised by that.
I do think that it's actually a fun fact. A great first date in Poe's day was a walk through the cemetery.
Didn't know that. Didn't know that.
They're park-like, they're quiet, they're beautiful, and it kind of sweeps away that small talk, right? Like, let's live today, baby. Let's make it.
Yes. I thought that was so like, wow. I didn't know I went on so many dates.
Just wanted to point out that Edgar Allan Poe's grandfather was not the only septuagenarian in the Battle of North Point. There was another 72-year-old named Uriah Prosser from Pennsylvania. He had been a Continental Army officer. Well, I'm not sure if he had a Continental Commission or a militia commission. I got to find out. But his son was in the 27th Maryland at the time of the Battle of North Point. And the 27th was one of the regiments that went out for the battle. And Uriah joined up and went with them and got killed for his troubles. He was one of the 24 Americans killed at the Battle of North Point. So you can imagine he survives the entire Revolutionary War, and then at the ripe old age of 72, gets popped off by the British at the Battle of North Point. And I wonder, we know that a lot of men were enlisting at the last minute, joining up in August and early September of 1814 to fall out with the militia. And I guess they were given arms and accoutrements and things like that. Probably were not in uniform. Scott Sheaves, whom some of you know, he comes here sometimes, retired ranger at Fort McHenry, probably knows more about the North Point campaign than anybody living, has tried to find more information about David Poe's company. And he said, the newspapers don't talk about, they obviously existed, they're on the muster roll. He said, I think there's just a unit that this guy formed up in August, just before the battle in September. They went out and fought the battle, and that was it. They broke up afterwards. Or they might have stayed together until the militia was relieved of duty in November. Bernard Todd, who lived here in 1814, was 2 years beyond the age of compulsive militia service. He may have been in the militia when he was younger, but he turned out with the Dragoons. But I found out he was only in them for 2 weeks. It was the 2 weeks during which the British burned his house and attacked
But this is also
Baltimore.
a family. They didn't get paid back. They are living in poverty in the last war that they fought so hard and gave so much. And he goes again. And that's a moving thing.
And the Todds, yeah, they got completely burned out because the British had seen with their telescopes from their ships that there were Dragoon vedettes down here and messages were being sent up and down the Chesapeake, and so they marked this place for destruction. An American who came here just a few days later said, there's nothing left. They burned the house, they burned stables, they burned this, they burned that, they killed all the livestock, they destroyed all the crops. That's the price you paid for supporting the Americans against the British during the War of 1812. Leave us alone, give us what we want, don't offer any resistance, we'll leave you be. Offer any resistance in your history. Well, the Taj rebuilt. That's the house we're in now.
Yes, sir.
Can you mention a little bit about his death, about the history of that, or you know, that it's unsettled?
It is unsettled. I can share with you what we know. I can share with you like the facts in the final days of Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was actually no longer living in Baltimore when he happens to die here. He arrives in the city, and he's really supposed to be passing through. He finished up a lecture tour potentially sort of fostering this new engagement to kind of reunited with what we would call a high school sweetheart. And she's a wealthy woman, a widow, who is sort of like watching to make sure, and Poe is on his best behavior, trying to convince her to marry him. So his plan is to travel from Richmond to New York, close his affairs in New York, where he's living at the time, and return. And he's bringing his aunt, Mariah Clem, who's waiting for him there, back with him. His journey will take him to Baltimore, and he's supposed to catch a train through Philadelphia, do a quick job, the editing job there, and go to New York, collect her, and come back. Instead, he never leaves Baltimore alive. When he arrives sometime in the end of September 1849, goes missing for about 5 days. Goes missing from the record, we should say, for about 5 days. We don't know what happened. He doesn't catch that train, and 5 days later, he shows up in a tavern, slumped over an armchair, semi-conscious, doesn't see, he's at least conscious enough to say who he is, and a printer, get his name at this moment, but sends a note to a known associate of Poe's saying, this guy going by the name of Poe is in really bad shape. He's at Fourth Ward Polls, and he needs help right away. So Joseph Snodgrass comes to Poe's side at the tavern, and met there by Henry Herring, who's a cousin of Poe's, and the two of them decide that whatever's going on with Poe, he's slumped over, filthy, looks like he's been rolled in the street. Whatever's wrong with him, it's not something he's just going to sleep off. So they throw him in a carriage, and he's taken to a hospital where he dies 4 days later. And very quickly, because he happened to die in a city where he had family, he's buried in the family plot next to his grandfather. And there's a place to put him, and he's put in the ground, and that's how he dies in Baltimore. But at no time does he recover enough to explain how he came to be in this terrible condition. And Poe was known to be very, very careful about his person, probably because he was not very, very wealthy. There's some years that are better than others, but Poe's not a wealthy man, but had that Southern gentleman upbringing, and so was always dressed in Johnny Cash black and always just very passed off as a gentleman. So for him to be found in this shameful condition is pretty out of the ordinary and scandalous. Now, Poe, some people believe that he died unknown, and the fact is that Poe was actually quite famous in his lifetime. But remember, fame does not equal fortune for any member of the Poe family, but he is quite a celebrity. So part of the reason why his death is still a mystery is because the people at the end of his life behave quite badly. You mentioned a gentleman, his name's Rufus Griswold.
That's him.
Most famous, kind of a frenemy of Poe's. They've been contemporaries and professional, known each other professionally. But if you work in a setting where there's somebody at work you just can't stand, you gotta be polite to each other and you figure it out. But imagine that person is in charge of telling your life story. He becomes Poe's literary executor and uses Poe's celebrity to get really salacious and ugly. And a lot of what he wrote in that biography to this day has to get raked out of Poe's history. Really nasty stuff, that he was drunk, that he was crazy, that he was having incestuous relations with every single female member of his family, that just really nasty stuff that really confuses people because that persona of his writing, he's one of the first people to write from the first person of a madman, of a murderer, and this is seen as this very suspect gift, right? These are taboo subjects, this is a taboo point of view, and to do it so effectively, what's wrong with this guy? So the persona of Poe's writing confused, people believe that ugly stuff, and that celebrity makes it possible. But Griswold, to be fair, isn't the only one, he's just the worst example. The doctor at in Baltimore, where Poe is taken, where Poe dies, Dr. Joseph Moran, he dines out for the rest of his life talking about the last days of Poe. And what starts out as a simple death in the hospital turns into deathbed speeches, extra symptoms. The guy goes on tour, he writes a book, like all these things that we see people do with celebrities today. This happens to Poe. And again, Poe was quite famous in his lifetime. So all of that celebrity, all of that tabloid kind of stuff, these stories start to swirl about Poe. So that's part of the reason why it's so muddy, because even if the doctor's account can't be trusted, those extra symptoms that over time he's embellishing his story, it's hard to know what really killed Poe. So I will remind everyone, though, that we're at this historic site talking about, this is pre-Civil War medicine, and people got wiped out all the time by very simple things. We were all wearing masks not too long ago, because if your immune system's compromised, something comes along and wipes you out. And this is very much the case in Poe's day. So Poe had already been feeling ill. He was traveling, middle 1800s, taken to a hospital, not necessarily a place you go to get better. And just about anything could have killed Poe. So there are a lot of different theories, but those are the circumstances, and that's what we know.
A couple things.
Sure.
His name, Edgar Allan Poe, and foster family was Allan. Is that pure coincidence, or did he take his middle name from that family?
He takes the middle name, that's how we get the name Edgar Allan Poe.
Second question, was there ever any answers found about the cognac story?
Oh, the Poe toaster.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
The Poe toaster and the cognac?
Yeah.
Referring to a story about a mysterious figure who, for several decades, would sneak into the cemetery on the night of Poe's birthday, and as a tribute, leave a partial bottle of cognac and some roses at Poe's grave. This became a huge thing because there was a picture. I think it really took off when there's a picture captured in Life magazine of this mysterious figure from a distance, and they were always trying to protect their identity, so this things get back. It is a mystery to this day. The timeline is kind of interesting when you consider that the tradition was supposed to have started maybe around 1949, which would have been the 100th anniversary of Poe's death. So I think a heightened interest in tributes to Poe. People come out on Poe's birthday. We have the festival around Poe's death day for this reason. So when you see these kind of like 100-year anniversaries, 200-year anniversaries, those kinds of things, you start to see these rituals begin. So there was a mention of a really good bottle, a really good vintage being left at Poe's grave, and so that's one of the first mentions of the toaster at the grave, and people start to look for this. And then in the 1970s, there is a shakeup at Poe House. New directors come in, and this interest is swirling about Poe. They're also doing some renovation stuff over at Westminster Hall, so there's this kind of interest in what's going on. The story starts to really gain traction, and part of that is around because of these goings-on in the city at the time. So I think that's where it gained steam, but there was a figure who would come every year, and it was very much a ritual. Now, the ritual officially stopped in 2009, which happens to coincide with 200 years of Poe's birth. So again, that 100, the 200, we see these numbers. But also, this is around the time everybody's got a cell phone, right? So everybody's stuffing pictures and video and grainy, all this other stuff. So it's probably stopped it right about the right time. It looks like at the very end, it was already changing between different people at the time too, but it officially stopped. Now they hire someone to come out and do it now. It's much more.
So it has still continued.
It does continue.
It's just it's a known person. The whole it's planned.
It's a whole performance, a whole thing that they do. But it's a lovely ritual. It's a really nice thing to do. A tribute to Poe on his birthday every year. So if you want to hang out in a cemetery in January in Baltimore.
Do they know exactly where he's buried? You said he'd been buried 3 times?
He was buried in the same cemetery 3 times. How much time do we have? Are we good?
As much as you can talk.
Keep asking me questions, Allan. He was buried in the same cemetery 3 times. So I learned in this job, I did not know this before I came to Baltimore, that the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery is
One's in church.
one's got a church, exactly. When the Poes, they have a family plot at corner of Fayette and Green, and it's a graveyard. And when Poe is buried with the other members of his family, the church has not been built yet. And he's buried in the Poe family plot. Again, there's a place to put him, which is how he gets to be buried in Baltimore so quickly. And at that time, for like modern embalming, this kind of you want to do that fast. So Poe is buried. Now he's left in an unmarked grave. And that sounds kind of disrespectful, but none of the other family had markers necessarily. And eventually the family said they commissioned a stone to be put on his grave, and it's destroyed in a freak train accident. Checks in the mail, it never gets placed there. But the church is later built, and one of the reasons the church, Westminster, the church is built is to save the graveyard. You have several heroes of the Revolution and several heroes of 1812 buried in that graveyard. So they want to save it, so they build the church in that graveyard. And what's really fun, if you come to Westminster Hall, walk along the side of the building, they built it over the existing graveyard, so it creates these really cool catacombs right underneath the church, and they do tours where you can go in and you can see some of the people who are under the church. It's a really, really cool tour. But what this does is that it butts up against the Poe family plot, and some of the Poe family actually are even moved under the church. But Poe has no stone, and eventually the city of Baltimore gets a lot of heat for not properly honoring Poe, and he's in this unmarked grave at the back of the cemetery, and said, we got to do something about that. So as they often do, a school teacher and her students save the day. They start a Pennies for Poe campaign to give Poe a more fitting monument, and then a committee is eventually formed and money is eventually donated to give Poe a fitting monument. So the question is, where are you going to put it? You're going to put it on Poe's grave, but that church is there now. It's a little too close to the wall. So they dig him up and they move him over 12 feet, and they're going to put the monument there. But some people still don't like this because the whole point was to give him this beautiful monument, and they're doing something historic. This is the first monument in the United States created for an American writer. So this is a big deal, what they're doing. They want people to see it. They briefly talk about kind of knocking down the back wall so people can kind of see it from the street. And some people are just, you know what, just dig him up again, move him to the front, give him this place of honor at the front of the cemetery. And that's what happens. And so that monument is then placed there. So we know where Poe, we know it's Poe too, because, as I mentioned, J. Scott Watkins, related to George Spence. George Spence was the sexton at each of those spots. He was the one. He was the original guy who buried Poe. He knew exactly where the bodies were.
So the site is known.
The site is known. So Poe, literally Poe, is moved to the front, and that monument placed there. And that's actually his first stone. Now, when you come to Westminster Hall, you can wander. You'll see Poe's monument at the very, very front, and you can follow the path to the back, because people are interested in Poe's original grave. And eventually, in 1913, somebody places a stone at the back. You have to read it very carefully. It says, original burial place of Edgar Allan Poe. And the dates on the stone are the dates he was back there. But when you remember, he was dug up and moved over. Poe's original grave still doesn't have a marker. But
So the other one with the small mark, that was his second.
that was the second marker, right, in his second grave. But
And the first one is.
it's a yucca plant. It's
I'm saying.
it's right next to Patrick Allison, who was the first.
You said he moved him 12 feet, so you find the second marker and go 12 feet, you're going to walk over his first grave.
What's interesting too is Edgar Allan Poe visited these family members. He was curious about this, and George Spence related that a young Edgar Allan Poe visited that graveyard. So a young Edgar Allan Poe literally walked over his own grave, visiting his grandfather's grave, visiting unmarked. Elizabeth Cairns Poe's grave is not marked. It should be. It's not marked. So hopefully we'll do something about that someday soon.
I have a question. Actually, I have a few things. So, I think it's really interesting that you talk about like the grandfather's like passion. Like that was like his like help to fight for freedom for like Americans like getting away from Britain and things like that. He had that passion. I wonder if like maybe even Edgar kind of like just inherited that passion, but in a different way, just for writing. And maybe even though Poe's dad wasn't so good at acting, maybe he still also like inherited that passion.
In putting together this presentation, it's a lot of fun to read how every biographer tells a different story. Historians tell different stories, and how you tell a story, that rhetoric, that's important. How you tell a story is just sometimes as important as the story itself and the facts that you share. Hobson Quinn points out that David Poe Sr. going after that printer because of this thing that he's written about George Washington. He's mad at an editor and like threatens to tar and feather the guy, and like he's part of this whole thing. So it's a lot of fire and a lot of anger at an editor. David Poe Jr. unfortunately got a lot of terrible reviews, and unfortunately likely descended into alcoholism, probably partly because of that. But there are stories of him going after some of those reviewers who wrote some really nasty things about him. So, second generation, kind of going after these editors. And there are several stories of Edgar Allan Poe going after some editors he didn't like. So you've got 3 generations of guys that will kick an editor's butt.
They really don't like editors.
They will tell you what they think. So you do see that passion. And David Poe Jr., the despair of a dream unrealized, or his dream realized and failing, or the pain that comes with that, you can feel for him too, absolutely.
I feel like it's like a passion that they inherit this passion, but it comes out in different ways for them, which I thought was interesting. And to talk about the gravesite, so side note, I hear that when he was dug up, like those couple of times, the original coffin, like of course is like just wood, so it breaks apart. I know you guys have a piece of it, right? Or is that the other Poe?
Enoch Pratt Free Library has a shard of the coffin that you can go and see, and I highly recommend a visit. You have to make a reservation if you want to go see the Poe room or the collection there, but it's in this cool green box, and you open this up, and that's this coffin. One of the stories, though, that J. Scott Watkins shared with me is George Spence, when that first digging up happened, the coffin does break apart in all these pieces, and people are grabbing up pieces. Yeah. And because, again, Poe is so famous, you've got a lot of people, like far and wide, are like, I have a hand. I got a toe. It's all these like pieces of Poe pop up all over the country.
Someone made a pen. I picked up a wooden pen out of a piece of the coffin.
And all that stuff, like, again, those stories kind of still swirl around to this day. So that's just a lot of fun. But George Spence apparently was very upset at this notion because one of the stories goes that the thing broke apart and somebody picked up Poe's head and his brain swished around in there like mud in a bucket. And George Spence was really mad that that story came out because he considered himself a professional and would not have done that and didn't want anyone to think that he would ever treat a body with such disrespect. So,
2 questions. What was the time period from the first burial to the second burial?
30 years.
There wouldn't have been brain left to slosh around. Are there any Poe descendants still living in Baltimore?
There are several.
Or any place?
There are several Poes and there are several Clems. It's important to note Edgar Allan Poe did not have children. So anybody who's the great-great-great-great-grandson or great-great-granddaughter, I've had to disappoint a few of those folks. So that's not true. But cousins are cool. A lot of Poes and lots of Clems, yes. Any other questions?
I do have another one. So I know that you had the Clems here in Baltimore, Virginia, and so on, and then you had, David Poe Sr. and his wife Elizabeth. But I mean, I know they had more children, like you said, and of course I'm sure that the grandfather and grandmother had their own family. Were they not in contact with them at all?
They were. As a matter of fact, George and one of, I forget the name of the other brother, there were 3 brothers. George Poe dies on the prison ship Jersey.
Yes, I remember.
So, again, family devoted to liberty.
But I guess, back then, we didn't have cell phones, so writing and visiting, I guess, was few and far between.
I mean, they're big families, so you've got, I think, I have to look at it, 7 kids in the same family, and a lot of these folks living together. And note that when Mariah's, it looks like the grandparents have allowed their grandson to live with them. You've got multiple generations in this household, and Mariah Clem's caring for her mother, got her own kids. Families did stay together. You have a lot of connectivity with Nelson Poe, who was a cousin in the city, that connection. And the Poes and the Clems did marry one another a few times. So they did keep in contact with one another. Whether they're as noted as David Poe Sr., I don't think they were, but still an important family. Yeah.
So it said that David Poe Sr. served on the Baltimore City Council. Is there any information about that, how long he served or what he did?
There are some records. I don't know how long, but in the first council, yes. Okay. And it again, there's quite a bit of evidence of that history, and some of it's if you know that it's Edgar Allan Poe's granddad, it is kind of fascinating. But it's lists of of supplies and orders for, you know, getting money for this thing or getting money for this thing. There's so much of it. Some of it's kind of not as exciting or thrilling, but there is quite a bit of that support. And he was putting ads in the paper as a wheelwright, telling people I'm at this address and I'm ready to serve, and the kind of thing that you would see in your present day commercial. So we see evidence of that.
Okay. Do you know what party he was maybe a part of?
His obituary said Republican, and I think it was the Whigs. So I want to stress I'm not a war historian, so I will mess up some of the terminology, and I apologize for that. But we have quite a bit of history of his civic life in Baltimore.
I was just curious because, like, you know, with the Todd family here, we have the first Baltimore County executive, and then, like, you know, some councilmen in the family and so on. So.
If you look at Jay Scharf has the Chronicles of Baltimore, and I love actually reading it. You can sort of read it for a while, and you can do a search for how often Poe appears in the Chronicles of Baltimore. But quite a bit of civic engagement there, especially a founding member of the church, he and his brother, and that kind of thing. So.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Enrica.
We have a little token of appreciation for you. I think, yes, Jenny went and got it. Well, bring it up, Jenny.
Thank you. Don't show that to my husband, it's all mine.
You don't need to turn it
Oh,
off.
it's my Bible.
You can share it with Penn.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thanks again. You want to hang around a little bit in case anybody wants to talk some more?
I'll be here if anybody has questions.
Okay.
And I have my
Very
card
good.
if anybody would like to see.
Thank you again.